rain in England has never cared about rank. It falls on the debtor and the duke alike, soaking through wool and pride with equal indifference. It fell that night on a narrow street in Holborn, where a solicitor's office burned a single candle behind fogged glass, where papers sat drying on a mahogany desk, and where a transaction had already been completed before the woman it concerned ever stepped through the few door. She was 23 years old. She had 4 languages in her head, a leather satchel pressed against her ribs like armor, and a father who had left the building 20 minutes before her carriage arrived. He did not wait. He never did. Her name was Isolde Ashworth, daughter of Viscount Ashworth of Derbyshire. Eldest of 3 children, keeper of ledgers, her father could not balance, reader of letters her country could not afford to lose. She stood in the doorway of that office in a travelling cloak, the colour of wet slate, water dripping from the brim of her bonnet onto the floorboards, and she looked at the man seated behind the desk. He was not the Duke of Blackmere. She had prepared herself for the Duke. She had rehearsed the precise degree of courtesy that communicated dignity without submission. She had chosen her words. She had arranged her expression into something that would betray nothing. The man behind the desk was not the Duke. He was something far more complicated. And England, 1814, had absolutely no language for what was about to happen between them. She walked out into the rain, not knowing what she was walking toward. You do, and I promise you, what is waiting for Isolde Ashworth inside Mercer Hall is worth every single minute of the next 2 hours. If you are new here, hit subscribe right now, because this channel exists for exactly this kind of story. Dark, intelligent, earned. And drop a comment below telling me where in the world you are watching from tonight. I read every single one, and I genuinely want to know how far this story travels. Now, Chapter 1. Let us go to Yorkshire. Chapter 1. Isolde. The candle on the solicitor's desk had burned low enough that the wax had pooled into the brass holder and begun to set again. That meant it had been burning for at least 4 hours. That meant the papers on the desk were not freshly signed. That meant my father had been here well before I arrived. Which meant he had arranged for me to arrive after, which meant he had not wanted to witness the moment I understood what had been done. I noted all of this in approximately 6 seconds. Then I stepped fully inside and closed the door behind me. The man behind the desk rose. He was tall. Not in the decorative way of Mayfair gentlemen, not the elegant height of men who had been well fed since birth. His was the height of someone who had grown, despite everything working against it. His coat was dark and simply cut, and it fit him the way clothing only fits a man whose body has been shaped by something other than leisure. His jaw was angular. His eyes were the particular grey of Yorkshire winter sky, and they moved across me with an efficiency that I recognized immediately, because I used the same kind of looking myself. He was cataloguing me, measuring what I presented against what I might actually be. I let him. I was doing the same. "Miss Ashworth," he said. His voice was low, northern, still underneath the years of careful speech. You did not get a voice like that in a schoolroom. You got it in coal smoke and determination. "You are not the Duke," I said. "No, you are Cael Mercer." Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, exactly. More like the slight adjustment a very good card player makes when his opponent shows unexpected knowledge of the game. "I am," he said. I had heard the name twice. Once in a dispatch I had decoded 18 months ago, where it appeared as an asset designation rather than a name. Mercer, C. Operative confirmed elimination of the Fontainebleau courier, C. attached. The second time, in a whispered conversation between 2 Foreign Office clerks who had not realized I was behind a bookshelf in the lending library on Bond Street, one of whom said, "They say, Blackmere keeps a man who doesn't miss," and the other of whom had gone very quiet and changed the subject. I set my satchel down on the chair nearest the door. I kept my hands still, though the effort of it registered as a faint trembling in my fingertips that I pressed flat against my palm. "The viscount has settled his debt," I said. "I am to understand the terms." Mercer looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked at the solicitor, a small damp-faced man named Griggs, who had been trying to disappear into his own chair since I'd entered, and said, with no inflection whatsoever, "Leave us." Griggs left so quickly he forgot his own hat. Mercer moved from behind the desk. He did not come toward me. He went to the window, looked out at the rain-black street below, and spoke with his back partially turned, which told me he was not trying to intimidate through proximity. He was trying to give me space. I filed that away. "You will come to Mercer Hall in Yorkshire," he said. "You will have your own rooms, your own income, access to the library and the grounds. You will be under my protection in every legal and practical sense. You will not be a prisoner." "And in exchange?" I asked. He turned then. "Your father owed the Duke £60,000, accumulated over 8 years. War contracts, failed investments, one particularly catastrophic hand of cards in the spring of 1811. He paused. "The Duke has cleared the debt entirely." I was aware that £60,000 was not a sum one cleared for the pleasure of acquiring a viscount's daughter, however well educated. "And my value to the Duke," I said carefully, "is not matrimonial." Mercer's eyes were very steady. "No," he said, "it is not." I looked at the papers on the desk. I looked at the seal, black wax, the Blackmere crest, already dried. I looked at the solicitor's notes in the margin, written in the cramped shorthand of a man who copied exactly what he was told and asked no questions. I looked at the word intelligence asset written in a different hand than the rest. The Duke knew. He had always known about my work for the Crown. My father had sold that knowledge along with me. The realization arrived not as a shock, but as the confirmation of a suspicion. I had been carefully, not thinking since the letter arrived from my father's steward 3 weeks ago. I picked up my satchel. "When do we leave?" I asked. Mercer looked at me for a moment that lasted slightly longer than the others. "Tomorrow morning, 6 o'clock. I nodded. I walked to the door. I had my hand on the handle when he spoke again. "Miss Ashworth." I stopped. I did not turn. "You are not what I expected," he said. "I thought about that. I thought about the £60,000 debt. I thought about my father's empty chair. I thought about the word asset in someone else's handwriting on a document that had already been signed before I arrived." "No one ever is," I said, and I walked out into the rain. The carriage back to the hotel on the Strand carried me through streets I had walked freely 2 days ago. They looked the same. The lamplighter was making his rounds. A group of soldiers, young ones, newly returned from the continent, still wearing the lost expression of men adjusting to a world that had moved on without them, stood outside a public house. A woman sold hot chestnuts from a brazier on the corner, her breath making small clouds in the cold. England in November 1814, the war with France, not quite finished and not quite not. The Peace of Paris barely 8 months old and already cracking at the seams. The whole country holding its breath, not sure whether to celebrate or begin rationing again. I sat with my satchel in my lap, and I thought about what Cael Mercer had not said. He had not said the Duke's interest in me was merely financial. He had not said the arrangement would be simple. He had not said what was expected of me in practical terms. Not the domestic theatre of it, but the intelligence aspect. He had told me exactly as much as he needed me to know to consent to the carriage tomorrow morning, which meant either he was a man who dealt in economy, who gave information in minimum viable doses, or he did not know the full picture himself. I did not yet know which was more dangerous. I opened my satchel. Inside, under 3 carefully folded letters of French diplomatic correspondence that I had been in the process of decoding for the Crown, when my father's summons arrived under my working cipher notes and my current sketchbook, was a small leather journal in which I kept, in my own private code, everything I knew. I opened it to a fresh page. I wrote the date. I wrote the name, Cael Mercer. Below it, I wrote everything I had just observed in that office. Then I wrote, at the bottom of the page, a question I did not yet have the answer to. What does the Duke of Blackmere want badly enough to spend £60,000 acquiring it? I closed the journal. I looked out the window at the rain. I was not afraid. Fear was a luxury for women who had more options than I did. What I had instead was precision and patience, and a mind that had been sharpened to a very fine point by 2 years of the kind of work that nobody would believe a viscount's daughter capable of. The Duke had made a significant error. He had purchased a weapon. He had simply not yet realized it was already aimed at him. Chapter 2. Cael I had collected many things for the Duke of Blackmere in 6 years of service. Documents, information, objects that could not be obtained through legitimate channels, men who could not be persuaded by legitimate means. Twice, I had collected bodies, though the Duke's paperwork called these resolved liabilities, which was the kind of language that told you everything about the man who used it. I had never collected a woman. Isolde Ashworth arrived at the base of the steps of my carriage at 5 minutes past 6 in the morning, carrying 1 trunk and the leather satchel. The trunk was modest, the luggage of someone who had packed for function, not impression. She wore grey wool, a dark bonnet, sensible boots. Her hair was dark brown, and arranged without any of the elaborate architecture fashionable women subjected themselves to. Her face was pale in the way of someone who had been awake most of the night, and was not going to mention it. She looked at the carriage. She looked at the horses. She looked at the distance from the step to the carriage door. Then she climbed in, managed the step without assistance, not because I did not offer it, but because she did not wait, and settled herself by the window with her satchel on her lap. I got in and sat across from her. We left London in silence. For the first 2 hours she looked out the window. Not in the dreamy, unfocused way. She was watching the road, the tree line, the villages we passed. Once, just outside Grantham, she shifted slightly, and I realized she was doing what I had been doing since we left the city. Counting the road markers, noting the landmarks, mapping the route. When I'd done the same on this road 6 years ago, riding north for the first time, after the Duke's invitation found me in a military hospital at Portsmouth, I had done it out of a soldier's habit. The reflex of a man trained to always know how to get out. I wondered what had trained her. She did not speak until we crossed into the West Riding of Yorkshire, when the landscape changed abruptly, the rolling green of the southern counties giving way to something larger and more severe, a moor-grey sky pressing down on heather-dark hills, the villages stone-built and close to the earth. It looks like something that has survived considerable violence, she said, not quite to me, still looking out the window. Yorkshire, I said. Yes. She turned from the window then and looked at me with an expression I could not immediately catalogue. It was not hostility. It was not nervousness. It was the particular attentiveness of someone who was deciding how much of the landscape they intended to map. How long have you lived at Mercer Hall? She asked. 4 years, And before that, a military hospital in Portsmouth. And before that, Spain. She absorbed this. Salamanca? The word landed differently than I expected. She had not said it the way people usually said it. Not with the vague reverence of those who had read the dispatches, or the performed gravity of those who wanted to appear informed. She said it with the flatness of someone who had read the actual reports. Among others, I said. She nodded and returned to the window. Mercer Hall announced itself from the top of a rise half a mile before the gates. It was Georgian, solid, built of Yorkshire stone that had weathered to the colour of old bone. 4 stories, 12 windows across the front face, a walled garden to the east side that had been a kitchen garden in its previous life, and now grew mostly wild. The roof was sound, the walls were sound, and the whole structure gave the impression of having decided early on that it would outlast everyone who ever lived inside it. I watched her look at it as the carriage came down the approach road. She was not looking at the facade. Her eyes moved systematically. Gates, gatehouse, perimeter wall, angle of the approach, sight lines from the upper windows, distance from the tree line to the house. Then she looked at the house again, and I saw something change in her face. Not warmth, exactly, but a kind of recognition, as though it had met a standard she had not expected it to meet. The library, she said. Where is it? I blinked, of all the first questions. East wing. Ground floor. Good, she said, and that was the entire conversation about her new home. I showed her to her rooms myself. The housekeeper, Mrs. Blythe, was a practical woman of 60, who had served 3 previous occupants of this house, and had the useful quality of asking no questions she did not need answered. She had prepared the rooms in the east corridor, connected to the library by a narrow passage, which I had chosen deliberately, because a woman who asked about the library first was a woman who needed to be near it. Mrs. Blythe left. Isolde set her satchel on the writing desk and immediately opened it. She did not unpack. She removed the top layer, letters, papers, and spread them with a systematic efficiency that was entirely unlike the behavior of a woman taking possession of a room. It was the behavior of a woman resuming interrupted work. Miss Ashworth, I said. She paused. You will find the estate runs to a set schedule. Meals at 8, 2, and 7. The grounds are accessible at all hours. The village is 3 miles east. There is a horse available to you. I paused. You are not confined to this house. She looked up from the papers. Something in her expression shifted, so slightly it would have been invisible to anyone not watching very carefully. Thank you, she said. The words were simple, and she meant them precisely. Not warmly, not gratefully in any performative sense, but in the exact way of someone who had recognized a genuine concession and was acknowledging it. I left her to her work. That night, at 11:30, I could not sleep. I walked the house, as I always did when sleep refused me. A circuit I had done 3,000 times, every window checked, every door confirmed, the habit of a man for whom security was not a comfort but a compulsion. When I reached the east wing, I saw the light under the library door. I stopped. I could hear faintly the sound of pages turning, the sound of a quill being set down and taken up again. I stood outside the library door for 37 seconds. I know because I counted. Then I walked away. I lay in my room and looked at the ceiling and thought about what she had said about Salamanca. I thought about the specific quality of attention she had given to the road. I thought about the way she had looked at the hall's approach. Not the way a woman looks at a new house, but the way a scout looks at new terrain. I thought about the satchel she guarded more carefully than anything else she owned. I touched the signet ring on my right hand. It was a plain piece, no crest, no motto, not the ring of a family man. I had taken it from a French spy in Bartered in 1812, and worn it ever since, as a reminder that the line between who controlled information and who was controlled by it was extremely thin. Isolde Ashworth was not what Blackmere had described when he gave me this assignment. The Duke had said, a well-born girl with a useful skill, manageable, without complications. Manageable. I had watched her map my house from a moving carriage. I had watched her resume intelligence work 6 minutes after arriving in a stranger's home. I had watched her absorb the confirmation that her father had sold her without a single visible reaction, and then ask a question that told me she had already processed the worst of it and moved on to what came next. Manageable. The Duke did not know this woman at all, and I was beginning to suspect that the most dangerous thing happening under my roof was not the work the Duke had sent her here to do. It was the work she was doing for someone else entirely. Chapter 3, Isolde. The library at Mercer Hall was the most honest room in the house. Everything else in the building wore its function with a certain deliberate severity. The entrance hall with its stripped-back elegance, the dining room with its table set for one, the study with its locked cabinet and its single chair positioned at exactly the right angle to the fire. These were rooms designed by a man who had decided not to need things. But the library was different. Someone had simply filled it, over many years, with every book that interested them, without apparent system or social performance. Military history jostled against natural philosophy. Poetry sat beside surveying manuals. There were 3 different translations of Caesar's Gallic Wars, and 2 copies of a French grammar text that looked well used. I stood in the middle of the room at midnight on my first night at Mercer Hall and understood something about Cael Mercer that he had not told me and almost certainly never would. He was a man who had educated himself with ferocious private hunger. Every book in this room was a door he had opened by sheer force of will. I set my candle on the large reading table and got to work. I had 3 intercepted French letters in my satchel that had been waiting for my attention since the week before my father's summons arrived. They had been forwarded to me through the usual channel. A bookseller on the Strand who received my orders for scholarly texts and sometimes tucked folded papers between the pages. The letters were written in a variation of the running key cipher that the French diplomatic service had been using since 1812, a system in which the key changed every 14 lines based on prearranged text, in this case a collection of La Fontaine's fables. I had broken the system 8 months ago. The Foreign Office knew. The Duke knew, but because the Foreign Office had made the catastrophic decision of telling him. I worked for 2 hours. The fire had burned to coals, and I had added 3 pieces of wood from the basket by the time I heard the footsteps in the corridor outside. They were very quiet, measured, not the heavy tread of a servant woken by the light under the door. They stopped outside the library. I did not look up, I kept writing. After a pause that lasted perhaps 40 seconds, the footsteps moved away. I set down my quill and looked at the door for a moment. Then I looked at the decoded text in front of me. The letters discussed a rendezvous, a meeting in England to take place in the new year, at a location referred to only as the White House in the north. The purpose of the meeting was described as the verification of the asset's continued reliability. The asset was referred to by a code name I had seen before in other correspondence, in other interceptions that I had decoded and submitted, and that had subsequently disappeared from the Foreign Office's active files without explanation. The asset's code name was Blackbird. I knew what Blackbird was. I had known for 4 months. The Foreign Office apparently did not, or if they did, they were not acting on it. Blackbird was a British national of high social standing, who had been passing military intelligence to the French since 1810. I had traced the correspondence thread from Paris to London, to a name that the Foreign Office had seemed disinclined to pursue with any urgency. I had not yet discovered why. I was beginning to form a hypothesis. I folded the decoded letters very carefully and placed them back in my satchel. I closed my sketchbook. I had been drawing reflexively while I worked. The library's dimensions, the window placement, the door locations, the distance from the reading table to the passage that connected to my rooms. A habit, an old one. I put out the candle and went to bed and lay in the dark with the cold Yorkshire silence pressing against the windows. In the morning, Mrs. Blythe brought tea and a brief, practical account of the household's routines. She told me the grounds extended to approximately 80 acres, that the moors began half a mile north of the walled garden, and that Mr. Mercer took his breakfast early and was usually gone from the house by 7. Gone where? I asked Mrs. Blythe smiled with the particular serenity of a woman who had learned not to ask. His business varies, miss, she said, and poured more tea. I spent the first week at Mercer Hall learning the house. I walked every corridor. I noted every external door, every window that could be opened from outside, the angle of every fireplace and the flue direction. I sketched as I went. Architectural details, a habit that had begun when I was 12, and my mother's estate in Somerset had caught fire, and the thing that saved 3 members of the household staff was my mother's knowledge, from years of daily occupation, of exactly where every exit was. My mother had survived. 2 of the servants had not. I had been drawing buildings ever since. By the end of the week, I had a complete sketch map of Mercer Hall in my book. An accurate one, with measurements I had paced out carefully, Cael Mercer noticed on the 6th day. He came into the east garden where I was sitting on the low wall, with my sketchbook open, measuring the distance between the garden door and the gate in the perimeter wall, by counting my steps in my head while I drew. He moved quietly for a very large man. I did not hear him until he was close enough that his shadow fell across my book. I did not close it. I kept drawing. He stood beside me for a moment and looked at what I was drawing. The garden, the walls, the gate, accurate distances, architectural notations in my small hand in the margins. "You are mapping the estate," he said. I set my pencil down. "I am sketching the garden." "You have been sketching the garden for 6 days," he said, "and the library, and the entrance hall, and the east corridor." I looked up at him. His face was in the flat afternoon light, and I could read nothing useful in it. "I sketch buildings," I said. "I always have. It is a habit, not a stratagem." "You wrote measurements in the margin," he said. "I am interested in architectural proportion." He looked at me steadily. "Miss Ashworth, did the Duke send you here to map Mercer Hall?" I held his gaze. "The Duke sent me here because my father owed him £60,000, I said. "If the Duke wanted a map of your estate, he could simply ask you for one. He owns the deed." That landed. Something moved behind his eyes, not quite anger, more like the particular discomfort of a man who has heard a true thing he would have preferred not to hear spoken aloud. He looked at the sketchbook for another moment. Then he turned and walked back toward the house. I watched him go. Then I looked down at my book, at the careful, accurate dimensions of every room in this house, at the measurements that had nothing to do with architecture and everything to do with survival. I closed the book. I had not lied to him. What I had done was answer a different question than the one he was actually asking. He had asked whether I was working for the Duke. I had told him the Duke did not need me to map Mercer Hall. Both things were true. Neither answered the real question. The real question was why I needed to know exactly how far it was from the library window to the perimeter wall to the road that ran north across the moors. The answer to that question was something I was not yet ready to give anyone in this house, but I was beginning to think that, of everyone in it, Cael Mercer was the one who had the best chance of understanding it if I did. Chapter 4. Cael the Duke arrived on a Tuesday. He did not send word ahead. He never did. It was a small theatre of power that he performed for everyone, arriving without warning, so that he could observe his various arrangements in their natural, unpolished state. I had learned to keep Mercer Hall in a permanent state of readiness for exactly this reason. The house was always clean. The wine was always decanted. The fires were always lit. I was at the far end of the south pasture when his carriage came through the gate, and I watched it from that distance, for a moment before I walked back to the house. The Duke of Blackmere was 39 years old and looked 10 years younger. He was lean, fair-haired, dressed with the effortless precision of a man who had never once had to consider the cost of his clothing. He had the particular charm of men who had grown up being told they were exceptional. A charm that was real, functioning, and almost entirely without warmth underneath. He was standing in the entrance hall, hat in hand, when I came inside. "Mercer," he said pleasantly, "you look well. Yorkshire agrees with you." "Your Grace," I said. "And our guest?" He looked past me as though Isolde might be standing in the corridor. "I trust she is settled. She is well, Your Grace." "Excellent." He handed his hat to Mrs. Blythe and walked into the drawing room as though he owned it. Because he did. I should like to dine with her this evening. A private arrangement. Just the three of us. I have some correspondence that requires a particular skill. I kept my face still. "Of course." He settled into the chair by the fire and stretched his legs and smiled at the room. "You have made this place rather comfortable, Mercer," he said. "I sometimes forget how well you manage domestic arrangements." He said it the way he said everything. Pleasantly, without malice, with just enough condescension built into the grammar to remind me precisely what I was. Isolde came to dinner in a gown of dark blue that I had not seen before. She had dressed with the same functional elegance she brought to everything. Nothing ornamental, nothing that would impede movement. Her hair was simply arranged. She wore no jewelry. She moved into the dining room and assessed the situation in the time it took to cross the threshold. I watched her do it. The quick inventory of the table, the placement of chairs, the single folded paper lying beside the Duke's wineglass. She registered all of it and showed none of it in her face. The Duke rose when she entered. He bowed with an extravagance that was designed to seem respectful and was actually a performance. "Miss Ashworth," he said, "you are looking remarkably well for a woman who has been transplanted to the moors." "Yorkshire is bracing, Your Grace," she said. "One acclimates." He laughed. He genuinely liked it. I could see the pleasure it gave him to find that she was not subdued. The Duke liked sharpness in the people around him because he was confident of his ability to manage it. She sat. I sat. The Duke sat. Mrs. Blythe's kitchen had produced roast pheasant, which the Duke commented upon favorably while managing, with effortless social precision, to make every compliment carry a faint implication that the comfort existed at his sufferance. Through the soup course, he talked about London. Through the fish course, he talked about the peace negotiations. Through the meat course, he set down his fork and looked at Isolde with the direct, assessing look he usually reserved for subordinates he was preparing to deploy. "I have something I should like you to look at," he said, and reached for the folded paper beside his glass. He placed it on the table and slid it toward her. She did not reach for it immediately. She looked at him first. Then she picked it up. It was a short piece, 8 lines of text in French, written in a cipher I recognized as a simple columnar transposition. Basic. The kind of thing a junior code clerk could break with an hour and a pencil. The kind of thing a woman of extraordinary ability would manage in under 2 minutes. Isolde looked at it for 1 minute and 40 seconds. Then she set it down and said, "The second column reads before the first. The message is, the shipment will leave Calais on the 14th. The remainder is a coordinate reference." She paused. "Is that sufficient, Your Grace, or do you need the coordinates as well?" The Duke smiled. "Quite sufficient." He folded the paper and pocketed it. "I am glad to see that travel has not dulled your remarkable faculties, Miss Ashworth." She looked at him. Her hands, I noticed, were resting flat on the table in the particular way she used when she was pressing the trembling out of her fingertips. "I am glad to be useful," she said. The words were simple, and they contained absolutely nothing. The Duke drank his wine and turned the conversation to something lighter. A particularly scandalous marriage settlement he had recently witnessed in London, which he described with great amusement, while I sat at the far end of the table and watched Isolde watch the Duke. He left his study door open when he went upstairs to change before departing the following morning. I know because Isolde told me. Not directly. She told me by the way she moved when she passed the study door on her way to breakfast. A slight hesitation, the almost imperceptible shift of attention that told me she had seen something inside that room worth noting. When I checked the study myself, an hour after the Duke's carriage had left through the gate, the papers on the desk were arranged exactly as the Duke had left them. Nothing had been taken, nothing had been moved. But Isolde's sketchbook, which I had glanced at the previous week, had a new page in it. Not a sketch, a grid of letters, arranged in columns, in her small, precise handwriting. I did not understand what it meant, but I understood what it was. She was recording something she had seen in the Duke's study. I sat with that for the remainder of the day. I took my evening meal alone, because Isolde had asked for a tray in the library, and I sat at the dining table and turned my signet ring on my finger with my thumb. The habit of it, the old reflex, the gesture that arrived when I was making a calculation that was going to cost something. The Duke had placed her here to extract intelligence through proximity. He had told me she was an asset to be managed. He had not told me she was already operating independently. He had not told me she was taking independent notation of his private correspondence. He had not told me because he did not know. And I sat there, in the dining room of my own house, turning a dead man's ring on my finger, and thought about what I was supposed to do with that information. Then I thought about the way she had pressed her hands flat on the table during dinner, the fierce, quiet effort of that, the refusal to show anything she did not choose to show. I thought about the fact that this woman had been sold, placed in a stranger's house, put on display for the man who had purchased her, asked to perform her most private and hard-won skill as an after-dinner entertainment. And she had done all of it without a single visible crack. I went to the library. I knocked. "Come in," she said. She was at the reading table, and she closed the sketchbook before I was fully through the door. Not furtively, smoothly, the motion of someone accustomed to operating with sensitive materials. I set a better sketchbook on the edge of the table. Black linen cover, 200 pages of the best hot-press paper I had ordered from the London stationer 3 days after she arrived, for reasons I had not fully articulated to myself at the time. She looked at it, then she looked at me. Your previous one is running low, I said. She opened the new book. She ran her fingers across the first page in a way that was entirely unguarded. The same way I had once watched a man in Badajoz run his fingers across a letter from his mother. Thank you, she said quietly. I stood by the door. There were a great many things I could have said. I said the simplest one. The Duke does not leave correspondence on his desk by accident, I said. She looked up. Her expression was perfectly composed. No, she agreed, he does not. We looked at each other across the library, across the candlelight, across the several hundred complicated things that were accumulating in the space between us. Good night, Miss Ashworth, I said. Good night, Mr. Mercer, she said. I left. I walked down the corridor and I did not touch the ring. For once, the calculation was not a difficult one. Whatever Isolde Ashworth had seen in the Duke's study, she had been meant to see it, which meant the Duke was testing her, or using her, or both. Which meant I needed to know what she had read before he did. Chapter 5, Isolde Dorothy Parish arrived at Mercer Hall on the first Wednesday of December in a hired cart from the village, with 2 trunks and an expression of absolute, unapologetic competence. She was introduced by letter, a note from the Duke, delivered the previous week, informing me that a lady's maid had been engaged on my behalf and would arrive within the fortnight. The note was phrased as a courtesy. It was not a courtesy. Dot was 26, dark-haired, sharp-featured, and she wore her assigned role with the comfortable ease of someone who had been doing things professionally for a long time. She unpacked my trunk in 40 minutes, reorganized my wardrobe in a way that was demonstrably more efficient than the arrangement I had used for 3 years, and then sat down at the foot of the bed and looked at me with candid brown eyes. I work for the Duke, she said. You should know that straight away. I looked at her. I appreciate the directness. I am to report on your activities and associations. Weekly, in a letter, he has provided me with a contact address in York. She folded her hands in her lap. I thought you ought to know that before you decided how much of yourself to show me. Why are you telling me? I asked. Dot shrugged, a gesture that was entirely too frank for a lady's maid and entirely suited to the person using it. Because you seem like a woman who would figure it out within a fortnight anyway. And I'd rather start honestly than be caught being dishonest. I studied her. And the reports you send to the Duke, will they be accurate? They will be truthful, she said, within the limits of what I actually observe. I am not in the habit of embellishing. A pause. I am also not required to report everything, only that which is specifically relevant to his interests. It was the most precisely honest form of equivocation I had ever heard. I found I liked her. Very well, I said. Then I will tell you one thing in return, for our equal footing. I already know you were placed here to observe me. I have known since the Duke's note arrived. Anyone assigned by the Duke specifically is either a genuine ally or an intelligence resource. You have just told me which. Dot looked at me for a long moment. Then she smiled, a quick, real thing, gone almost before it formed. Right, she said. I'll start the ironing. She became, over the following weeks, genuinely useful. She had an extraordinary fund of practical knowledge that had clearly been accumulated through unusual channels. She knew how to remove most common stains, including ink and several things she did not specify. She knew which household staff in the local gentry houses could be relied upon for gossip. She could pick a lock with a hairpin in under a minute, which she demonstrated once, seemingly on impulse, and then put the hairpin back in her hair and discuss the weather. She had, I was fairly certain, been trained by the same people who had trained me. We simply worked for different branches of the same complicated tree. On the 3rd week of December, she taught me what she called the social defense. The art of steering a conversation at a gathering away from topics that were dangerous, using a combination of apparently artless redirection and the very specific kind of feminine helplessness that made men feel simultaneously superior and eager to perform their superiority elsewhere. It was extraordinarily useful and deeply depressing, and we practiced it over tea until I could redirect almost anything. "You are very good at this," Dot observed. "I learned from my mother," I said. "She managed my father's social disasters for 20 years. She called it the navigation, making men believe they were sailing when they were being steered." Dot laughed, a genuine one, the kind that does not edit itself. Did it work for her? For a while I looked at my cup. She died in 2009. After that there was no one to navigate. I paused. My father ran aground almost immediately. Dot was quiet for a moment. Then she reached across the table and poured more tea. It was not a demonstrative gesture. It was simply the act of someone who understood that sometimes the most useful thing to do is to keep the cup full. That was when I decided to trust her. Not completely. I would not be so imprecise as to trust anyone completely. But enough. "There is something I need you to do," I said. She looked up. "I need to get a letter to London," I said. "Not through the York contact. A different address." Dot was still for a moment. "A Crown address," she said. Not a question. Yes. She considered this for a longer moment than I expected, which told me it was a genuine deliberation rather than a performance of caution. "All right," she said. "Tell me what you need." I wrote the letter that evening and sealed it with a plain wafer, no crest. In it I reported what I had decoded from the Duke's correspondence. The rendezvous, the reference to Blackbird, the coordinates. I added my developing hypothesis about the Duke's double-dealing. I encrypted the critical sections using the running key system I had adapted for my own communications, keyed to a text my Crown contact would recognize. Dot took the letter to the village the following morning with the household marketing list and dispatched it through a network I did not ask her to describe. That afternoon, Cael found me in the East Garden with my sketchbook and asked me, with his customary efficiency, whether I had sent anything outside the house without his knowledge. I said no, which was true, technically. I had sent it with Dot. He looked at me for a moment with that measured grey gaze, and then he said, "If you need to communicate with London, Miss Ashworth, I have a more reliable channel than whatever you have just used." I put my pencil down and looked at him. "And how would you know that I have used any channel at all?" I said. "Because Dot came back from the village with no parcels," he said, "and the marketing list called for 6 items, and only 5 arrived." I looked at him. The Yorkshire wind moved through the garden, and the dead grass bent sideways, and the sky was the particular pale grey of midwinter, and Cael Mercer stood in it, looking at me with an expression that had something new in it, that I was not immediately able to name. "You protect yourself," he said. "That is sensible. But this house is more secure than you yet understand, and the channel you use today runs through the York Post first." He meant the Duke's network. Dot's usual channel, the one she used for her reports. He was telling me the letter might be intercepted. "I know that channel," I said. "The letter was encrypted." "By you," he said, "using a system of your own devising." "Yes." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "Come to the study this evening. I have a cipher I have used for 6 years that the Duke has never broken." He walked back to the house. I sat in the garden for a while after, with the cold settling around me and the sketchbook open on my knee. The sketch I'd been working on was the garden wall. The precise height of it The angle of the gate, the distance to the road. I was not mapping an escape route, or rather I was, but it was not for myself. I was beginning to understand that the map I needed most urgently was not of this house. It was of the network of people inside it, and what each of them knew, and what each of them owed, and where each of them would break, if the pressure became sufficient. I was beginning to understand that Cael Mercer was either the most useful ally I had ever had, or the most dangerous trap the Duke had ever set, and I needed, with some urgency, to determine which. Chapter 6 Cael. Her cipher was elegant. I had been working with codes and encrypted correspondence for 6 years. The Duke ran a considerable intelligence operation alongside his more legitimate social enterprises, and I had become, through necessity rather than design, a competent reader of encrypted text. But what Isolde used was something different in kind. It was not a system she had been given. It was a system she had built, layered over itself, adaptive. When I looked at the letter she had sent through Dot's channel, she did not know I had retrieved the copy that had been flagged at the York post office through my own arrangement there, and I chose not to tell her. I could see the architecture of it, but not the key, which meant she had constructed something that required knowing not just the method but the mind behind it. I sat with it for 3 hours before I gave up and went to the study where I had told her to come. She arrived at 8 o'clock exactly. She sat in the chair across the desk from mine and did not look around the room the way most people looked around, rooms they had not been in before. She had already sketched this room. She already knew it. I placed my cipher on the desk between us. It was a double transposition system built on a key text. A passage from Caesar that I had memorized during a winter in Portugal with nothing to do, and a battered copy of the Gallic Wars for company. She looked at it. She turned the page once, then back. She picked up the quill from the inkstand and wrote 3 lines, then looked up. The key text begins with Gallia est omnis divisa, she said. I was very still. Yes, Caesar, she said. Book 1. She looked at what she had written. Your decryption was correct. The message reads, the courier will come through Bristol. I had taken 6 hours to decode that message when I first received it 2 weeks ago. She had done it in under 4 minutes. She set the quill down and looked at me with an expression that was entirely composed and contained just the faintest edge of something that might, in different circumstances, have been amusement. You are not going to ask me how, I said. I expect you know how, she said. The same way one does anything that requires sustained practice. Repetition and attention. She paused. Though I will say that hiding a 6-year operational cipher in a classical text that any educated person has access to is either extremely confident or slightly careless. It has never been broken, I said. By the Duke's people, she said, who are looking for complexity. Simple systems hidden in obvious places are frequently more secure than elaborate ones. She folded her hands on the desk, which is something the Duke does not understand about intelligence work. He is too attached to elegant construction. I looked at her across the candlelit desk in my study and thought about 6 years of working for the most powerful private intelligence operator in England and how this woman, who had been in this house for 6 weeks, had just said something about the Duke's fundamental strategic weakness that I had never articulated to myself in 6 years, but recognized immediately as true. What did you see in his study? I asked. The morning he left, she was still for a moment. Then she reached into the cuff of her sleeve and produced a single folded paper, which she placed on the desk with the directness of someone who has decided to move. I unfolded it. It was a copy, her handwriting, from memory, precise. a partial letter in French with her decoded translation beneath, and below that, a set of annotations in her small hand, cross-referenced with interception from September, same coordinate pattern. Blackbird, and then a name I recognized. A name that, written in the margin of a piece of intelligence notations in a Yorkshire study on a December evening, felt like the trigger of a loaded mechanism being drawn back. "You are certain," I said. "I have been certain since September," she said. "I submitted a report to the Foreign Office in October. No action was taken." She looked at me steadily, which means either the Foreign Office has determined that the intelligence is unreliable, or someone in the Foreign Office does not want the matter pursued. Given what I know about the Duke's connections, I consider the second more probable. I set the paper down. I touched my ring, the old reflex. "If this is correct," I said slowly, "the Duke is not merely conducting private intelligence work. He is selling active Crown intelligence to French interests." "Yes," she said. "During a war," I said, "that cost 42,000 British soldiers their lives." She said nothing. She did not need to. The weight of it was already in the room. I looked at the paper again, at the name in the margin. "What are you going to do with this?" I asked. "I have been attempting to get it to the right person in the Crown's intelligence apparatus," she said. "A person who is not connected to the Duke's network. That is, somewhat more difficult than it should be." She paused. "I need a route." I looked at her. "Why are you telling me this?" She met my gaze and did not look away. "Because you are either the Duke's most trusted instrument," she said, "or the one person in his circle who has the access and the capability to help bring him down. And I have been watching you for 6 weeks, Mr. Mercer, and I cannot yet determine which, but I find myself—" She stopped. "Yes," I said. "I find myself more inclined to trust you than is strictly prudent," she said, "given the circumstances." The fire had burned low. The candle between us was throwing uneven light across the desk and across her face, and in it she looked exhausted in a way she never showed in daylight. The specific exhaustion of someone who had been carrying something alone for too long. I thought about the route she needed. I had it, a direct channel to the Crown that bypassed the Duke's network, established through a contact at the Horse Guards who had known me since Salamanca and owed me a debt of the unforgeable kind. I thought about what it meant to use it. I thought about 6 years of service and £60,000 of someone else's debt, and a woman who had been sold like a parcel and had arrived with her head up and her work already in progress. I touched the ring. Then I took it off and set it on the desk, a gesture I had never made to anyone. "I know a route," I said. Chapter 7, Isolde. The house party at Ashley Court was announced a week before Christmas in a letter from Lord and Lady Pemberton that arrived, addressed to Mr. Mercer and Miss Ashworth. With the careless social confidence of people who do not question their own assumptions about who belongs together, the Duke had arranged it. He mentioned this in a separate letter to Cael, which Cael showed me without being asked, which told me something about how far we had moved from where we had started. The letter was brief. Attend the Pemberton gathering. Miss Ashworth is to make the acquaintance of the Marquis de Villiers. The Marquis has information I require and will be more forthcoming with a charming companion than with my direct representative. Miss Ashworth will know what questions to ask. I read this twice. Then I set it down on the study desk with a steadiness that cost me something. "He knows about the Marquis," I said. Cael was watching me. "Who is the Marquis de Villiers?" "He is a French émigré who settled in England in 1802, I said, and my voice was entirely level, because it needed to be, because if I let the other thing in, the recognition, the cold, specific horror of it, I would lose the thread. He attends every significant social event in the northern counties. He is very charming. He has a reputation for excellent wine and impeccable politics." I paused. "He is also the contact designated in the September interception. He is the man who was expecting to meet the asset at the White House in the north." Cael was very still. "He is the French contact." "Yes," I said, "and the Duke is sending me to meet him, which means—" "He knows you are the asset," Cael said. "He knows the French believe you have been working for them." "He has known since he bought my father's debt," I said. "It was presumably part of the calculation." I looked at the fire. "The French intelligence network believes I turned in 1812. I have been submitting material to them, through my crown contact, who tailored it, as part of a controlled operation. The Duke knows this. He intends to use the French contact meeting to extract whatever information de Villiers is carrying. And then—" I stopped, and then, Cael said quietly, "He no longer needs you." The word eliminate sat between us without being spoken. "Yes," I said. Cael stood up from behind the desk. He moved to the window and looked out at the dark moors. I watched his hand move to the ring on his right hand and then stop, hovering, before he lowered it deliberately to his side. "We go," he said, "but not as the Duke's instruments." We arrived at Ashley Court on the 22nd of December in Cael's carriage, with Dot and Cael's manservant, a quiet, capable man named Terence, who had the economy of movement of someone trained in similar circumstances to his employer. The house party was everything a Yorkshire winter gathering of minor aristocracy and newly moneyed gentry aspired to be. Fires in every room, excellent food, music in the evenings, and the ambient hum of social positioning that never quite stopped, regardless of the festive occasion. Lady Pemberton had the social management ability of a field general, which I admired even as I navigated the deployment of it. The Marquis de Villiers was there on the first evening. He was 60, elegant, with the slightly theatrical melancholy of a French aristocrat in permanent exile. He moved through the room with the ease of long practice. When he found me, which he did within the first quarter hour, he managed it with a social grace that made it look like chance. "Mademoiselle Ashworth," he said in French, with the small, private emphasis on mademoiselle that was a recognition signal. "I have heard of your remarkable facility with languages." I responded in French, with the correct counter-signal woven into an entirely innocuous sentence about the weather in Yorkshire, and watched his eyes confirm receipt. Then I went to find Cael. He was by the fire at the far end of the room, talking to no one, which was not because no one had tried. He had a quality, in a room full of people, of being precisely as present as he chose to be, and no more. Several women had approached him during the first hour. He had responded to each with polite, minimal brevity. And they had retreated slightly puzzled, as though they'd walked into a wall that was not there a moment ago. I stood beside him and spoke under the noise of the room. He confirmed the signal, I said. He will try to arrange a private meeting. "When?" Cael said. "Tomorrow, I expect. Under cover of the carol singing in the village, Lady Pemberton has arranged for the household to attend." "And what does he want from you?" I looked at the fire. "He wants confirmation that I am still operational," I said. "That I am still inside a circle of intelligence interest. He wants to know what I have access to." I paused. "He also, I believe, wants to warn me." "Warn you of what?" "That there is someone in the British intelligence apparatus who has ordered my termination," I said. That is what the September communication was moving toward. Someone has decided that the controlled feed operation I have been running is no longer useful to them and that I have become a liability. I looked up at him. The Duke has positioned himself to execute that order personally. Here, at the most socially chaotic point of the gathering, in a way that will look like an accident. Cael said nothing for a moment. Then he said, very quietly, "When?" "Boxing Day," I said. "That is my assessment of the timing. The household will be engaged with the tenant celebrations. There will be a great deal of movement." A carriage accident on the road back from the village would be straightforward to arrange. The fire crackled between us. Someone across the room laughed at something, and the sound was very bright against the quiet of our conversation. "We will not be on that road on Boxing Day," Cael said. "No," I agreed, "we will not." He turned from the fire and looked at me with the full weight of that grey gaze, and there was something in it that he did not try to manage or contain. "You have known all of this since September," he said, not accusing, measuring. "I have known most of it since September," I said. "I have known the timing since I decoded the letter in your library on my first night." "Here, you decoded it the first night," he said. "Yes." A long pause. "And you did not tell me." "I did not know you," I said. "I did not know if you were part of it." I held his gaze. "I know now." He looked at me for a moment that lasted slightly longer than the ones before. Something moved in his expression that he did not stop in time. "After the village tomorrow," he said, "we go directly to the hunting lodge on the North Moor. Terence has it prepared. Dot comes with us." "And the Marquis' information?" I said. "You get it in the village," he said. "In the open. Under observation, and then we leave." I nodded. He turned back to the fire. I stood beside him and looked at the room full of people with their wine glasses and their festive small talk and their magnificent ignorance of what was occurring in the space between the two of us at the far end of the room. "Mr. Mercer," I said. "Yes," he said. "Thank you," I said. He did not say "you are welcome." He said very quietly, "Don't thank me yet." And there was enough in those 3 words. The yet, the particular tension in it, the implication that what was coming was worse than what had passed. That I felt it differently than I had felt anything in quite some time. Chapter 8. Cael the Marquis de Villiers was, for a French intelligence operative in his 7th decade, remarkably composed under the circumstances of a Yorkshire village carol service in freezing December rain. He and Isolde stood at the edge of the congregation, slightly apart from the Ashley Court party, and spoke to each other in the way that very practiced social performers speak when they do not want to appear to be speaking about anything of consequence. I stood 12 feet away with Terence at my shoulder and watched the exchange. It lasted 6 minutes. When it ended, de Villiers bowed and withdrew back into the crowd with the unhurried ease of a man who had been doing this for 40 years. Isolde found me in the carriage on the return to Ashley Court, slipping inside before the rest of the party had assembled on the steps. Her face, in the grey light, was composed. Her hands were pressed together in her lap, the faint trembling visible along the line of her fingers. Not fear. I now understood. Never fear. Fury contained. "He confirmed it," she said. "The order came from within the Foreign Office. The contact who handles the controlled feed is compromised. He has been feeding information about my operation to the Duke since the spring." "Your Crown contact," I said. "Was the source of the leak?" "Yes." She looked at me steadily. "I suspected in August. I could not confirm it until de Villiers." "What else?" She was quiet for a moment. "He said the man giving the order to have me removed is known to the French network as Larkspur. He does not know the English identity. The French only know the code name." She looked out the window, but he gave me the contact signature, the specific cipher mark that Larkspur uses in correspondence. "And," I said. She reached into her cuff and produced a small folded paper. She held it out. I took it and unfolded it. The mark was a small, specific notation, a way of placing the date in encrypted correspondence that I had seen before. Once, in a letter on the Duke's desk that I had delivered personally and watched him read. I folded the paper and put it in my coat pocket. "We need to leave Ashley Court tonight," I said. We reached the hunting lodge on the North Moor by midnight. It was a simple structure, 2 rooms, stone-built, set against the shoulder of the hill, with a view across the moorland that in daylight would have been extraordinary. And in the December, dark was simply black silence. Terence had laid a fire. There were provisions for a week. Dot took possession of the inner room with the efficiency she brought to everything, and produced, from a bag I had not seen her carry, a small arsenal of useful items including a second-hand copy of a Quaker almanac, 3 changes of linen, a jar of something medicinal, and a pistol. "Where did you get the pistol?" Isolde asked. "I had it when I arrived," Dot said, without particular emphasis. "Mrs. Blythe thought it was a hat-pin case." Isolde looked at me. I looked at Dot. "It's loaded," Dot added helpfully. "I cleaned it this morning. I sat by the fire and let the lodge settle around me." Isolde was at the small table, her sketchbook open, writing by firelight. Not sketching, she was working through something, filling pages with small, dense notation. Her free hand was pressed flat on the table. The tremor was there, faint and constant. I had stopped pretending not to notice it. On the second day at the lodge, when Terence had gone to the village for provisions, and Dot had fallen asleep in the inner room by the fire, the silence of the moors became absolute. Isolde set her work down and stretched her neck, a motion she did only when she thought she was unobserved. "What are you writing?" I asked. She glanced at me. Then she looked at the book. "A record," she said, "everything I know, every intercept, every decoded communication, every link in the chain from the Duke to the French network." She paused. "If something happens to me, it needs to exist on paper in a form someone else can read." "Nothing is going to happen to you," I said. She looked at me with a gentleness that was somehow worse than all her composure. "You cannot promise that." "I can make it very nearly certain," I said. "And you?" she said. "What about you, Mr. Mercer? What is very nearly certain for you?" I looked at the fire. "I am somewhat harder to kill than most." "I know that," she said. "That is not what I was asking." The quiet between us shifted. Outside, the wind moved across the moor with a sound like something breathing. "You asked me once," I said, "in the carriage coming north, whether I was at Salamanca." "Yes." "There was a night in August 1812, I said, when I was in a position to make a choice. The Duke of Blackmere was in a building that was about to come down. I could have walked away. No one would have known. The war was moving east, and Blackmere was one man, and the building was burning. I paused. I went back in. I carried him out. I told myself it was because leaving a man, any man, was something I could not do." Isolde was listening with the complete, unperformative attention that was one of the most distinctive things about her. "I have spent 6 years since then doing his work," I said. "Telling myself the distinction between what I am and what he is lies in the fact that I have a line I will not cross." I turned the ring on my finger. "I am no longer certain that distinction is as clear as I believed it." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The distinction is that you are telling me this." I looked at her. "Men like the Duke," she said, "do not examine the line. They do not notice there is one." She looked at the fire. "My father sold me for £60,000 without waiting to see my face. He does not know he crossed a line because he never saw it. You see yours. You have always seen it." She paused. "That is not nothing, Mr. Mercer. I should have left it there. I should have gone back to the fire and the silence and the cold professional architecture of the arrangement between us. I did not leave it there, I said. You have been in this situation for 4 months, managing it alone. Before that, 2 years of intelligence work that no one would credit you with, that you did without support, without recognition, without a single person who knew the full weight of it. She was very still. And you arrived at my house, I said, in the rain, with 1 trunk and a satchel, and your work already in progress, and you have not, for a single moment in 6 weeks, asked anyone for help in the way I mean. I asked you, she said, in the study. You did, I said, which cost you something. She did not answer. The fire was very low. The silence outside the lodge was the particular silence of a moor that had been here for centuries and would be here long after, indifferent and enormous. Isolde, I said. She looked up. It was the first time I had used her given name, and we both knew it. You are not alone in this, I said. Not any longer. She looked at me for a long moment with those dark eyes that were so rarely fully readable. Then she said, I know, and her voice had something in it that was not quite steady, not from fear, not from fury, but from the simple human difficulty of receiving something you have needed for a very long time. I crossed the room to where she was sitting. I sat beside her at the small table, close enough that the warmth of her was perceptible in the cold lodge air. I did not touch her, not yet, not until she lifted her left hand from the table, the one with the tremor, and turned it over, and I placed my hand beneath it, steady, still, taking the weight of it. We sat like that while the fire died. It was not a small thing. It was not a gentleman's gesture. It was the act of a man who had been in very cold places for a very long time, recognizing warmth and being unable to walk away from it. When she turned to look at me, I kissed her. It was not violent or desperate. It was the kiss of 2 people who had been circling each other for 6 weeks and had finally stopped pretending to be somewhere other than exactly here. She kissed me back with the same composed, precise, devastating quality she brought to everything. When we parted, she rested her forehead against mine for a moment. We are going to be extraordinarily complicated, she said. Yes, I said. Good, she said, and she picked up her quill and went back to work. They are going to face the Duke with everything they have built between them in 8 weeks. And what they have built is more dangerous to him than anything he anticipated. If this story has found you tonight, please take 5 seconds right now and hit that like button. It tells the world this kind of storytelling matters, and it brings this channel to people who are still looking for it. Chapter 9 is where everything accelerates. Stay with me. Chapter 9, Isolde. I fell in love with a man who checked the door locks before he slept. Not metaphorically, Cael made a circuit of the hunting lodge every evening without fail. Every window, every door, the latch on the shutter, the bolt at the rear entrance. He did it quietly and without comment, and returned to the fire and opened his book. I knew it was the trained reflex of a man who had slept in places where the difference between locked and unlocked was the difference between alive and not. I knew it was not something he would ever entirely stop doing. I found it, unreasonably, one of the most reassuring things about him. We had 3 days at the lodge before Terence came back from the village with provisions and news. The Duke had been asking after us at Ashley Court. Lady Pemberton had been told we had departed due to illness. The Duke had sent a letter to Mercer Hall that Terence had intercepted from the post, a brief, civil, inquiring note, and a second letter, addressed to Dot at a York address, that Terence did not open, but set on the table in front of us both. Dot came out of the inner room. She looked at the letter for a long moment. "That's his mark," she said, "the seal." She did not pick it up immediately. I watched her. In the 3 days at the lodge, she had been exactly herself. Capable, irrepressibly practical, with a dark sense of humor that emerged primarily when things were most dangerous, which suggested it was a coping mechanism of long standing. She had demonstrated the correct way to bandage a head wound using a torn petticoat. She had taught me to fire a pistol. She had beaten Terence twice at cards. But she looked at the Duke's letter the way people look at something they have been dreading. "Open it," Cael said. She broke the seal and read it in silence. Her expression did not change in any large way, but I watched the small things. The slight tightening at the corner of her mouth. The single blink that was half a second too long. She set the letter down. "He has my brother," she said. "James. He's a private soldier, 4th Regiment of Foot. He says James has been charged with desertion under circumstances that are, he says, entirely fabricable, in the Duke's word." She folded her hands on the table. "He wants me to bring you to a meeting in York. Next week. Just you, Isolde. He says Mercer need not attend." The room was very quiet. "Just me," I said. "He says he has information about Larkspur that he will share only with you." She looked at me. "He says James will be freed the day you attend." I looked at the fire. I thought about de Villiers' information. I thought about the circuit of the Duke's intelligence operation, the precise place where it was most vulnerable, the window that would close once the Duke understood I had it. I thought about James Parrish, 22 years old, a soldier, facing a court-martial on fabricated evidence, because his sister had the misfortune of being placed in the household of a woman the Duke wished to control. "He is lying about the brother," Cael said. Dot looked at him. "He may have leverage over the boy," Cael said. "That may be true, but he will not release that leverage once he has you in a room in York. Isolde. Once he has you, you become the leverage, and the brother becomes irrelevant." Dot was silent for a moment. "I know that," she said. Her voice was very steady. "I know he is lying. I know the terms are not real." A pause. "I know that, Mr. Mercer." She stood up and went into the inner room and closed the door. I looked at Cael. He looked at the closed door. "She is going to do it anyway," I said. He said nothing, but he touched the ring. I went to the inner room and knocked. Dot said, "Come in a voice that was entirely composed, which was the most alarming possible version of it. She was sitting on the bed, her hands folded, looking at the wall. I sat beside her. "He will not let James go," I said. "I know," she said. "Dot," I said, "I need you to listen to me very carefully." She looked at me. "I have a plan," I said, "a real one, not a hope, but it requires every piece I have in position, and it requires time, 10 days, perhaps a fortnight. If you act now, before everything is placed, you will remove yourself from the board, and you will not help your brother. You will only destroy what we have built." I paused. "I can get James out of this, not through the Duke. Through the Crown contact that Cael has, a direct line to the Horse Guards, a man who knows what fabricated military charges look like, and has the standing to have them dismissed." I held her gaze. "But I need you here. I need you whole, and I need you to trust me." She looked at me for a long, long moment. 10 days, she said. "Perhaps 12, I said. "I will not waste a moment of them." She nodded once. Then she said, with the dark specificity that was quintessentially herself, "If this goes wrong, Isolde, I reserve the right to say a very great deal about it." "Noted," I said. I went back out to the main room. Cael had put another piece of wood on the fire and was standing at the window looking out at the moorland dark. 10 days, I said. "I need everything in place in 10 days. He turned from the window. "Tell me what you need." I sat at the table and opened my sketchbook to a clean page. "Everything I have documented about the Duke's network, the intercepts, the decoded communications, the coordinate references, the cipher mark linking him to Larkspur, is encoded in the architectural sketches in this book. I looked at the pages. Every room I have drawn since arriving at Mercer Hall contains a layer of notation that reads as architectural detail to an untrained eye and as intelligence documentation to the right reader. Cael looked at the sketchbook. Then he looked at me. "The book has been with me every day," I said. "The Duke has likely had it examined. His people will have seen drawings of rooms." I touched the corner of the page. They did not see what was in them. "Where does the book need to go?" Cael asked. "The Horse Guards," I said. "Your contact, the man who owes you Salamanca." He was quiet for a moment, then he reached for his coat. "Write me the address," he said. "Terence rides tonight." Chapter 10. Cael. Terence left at 10 o'clock with the sketchbook and a letter under my seal to a man named Colonel Richard Ashby at the Horse Guards, a man who had watched me carry the Duke of Blackmere out of a burning building in Salamanca, and who had said, on that occasion in the quiet way of soldiers who have just witnessed something they cannot put in a dispatch, "If you ever need anything, Mercer, and I mean anything, that offer stands for the rest of my life." I had never used it. I had kept it in reserve the way a man keeps the last charge in a firearm, knowing that when the moment came to use it, nothing less would serve. I watched the light of Terence's lantern disappear into the more dark, and then came back inside. Isolde was at the table writing. Dot had come back out of the inner room and was cleaning the pistol again, which was her method of processing disturbance. The fire was good. Outside, the December wind was doing its best to remind everyone that Yorkshire took no position on human difficulties. We spent the following 4 days in a self-contained routine. Isolde worked. I kept the perimeter. Dot and I took turns on a watch schedule that Dot claimed was unnecessary, because nothing interesting enough to visit a moor in December would attack them, but which she kept faithfully. On the evening of the 4th day, Isolde and I were alone by the fire. Dot and Terence had both gone to sleep at a sensible hour, and she set down her quill and looked at me with the direct attention that I had come to understand meant she was about to say something she had been deciding whether to say for some time. "Tell me about the coal town," she said. I looked at the fire. "Whitmore, South Yorkshire. Population 800 when I was born, 700 when I left at 15. What took you out of it?" "Hunger, mostly," I said, "and a recruitment sergeant with a silver tongue and a shilling." I paused. "And the particular variety of ambition that belongs to people who have been told often enough that the world does not extend beyond its current horizon." "Someone told you differently," she said. "A schoolmaster," I said. Old man. He had been a naval officer. He had 3 shelves of books and an opinion that the measure of a mind was not the station it was born in." I looked at the fire. I read every book on those shelves twice before I enlisted. "And after?" "After was the army," I said, "which is its own form of education." She was quiet for a moment. "Do you regret it? The service, what came after?" "I regret specific things," I said. "I do not regret the shape of my life until approximately 6 months ago, when the shape of it began to be insufficient." She looked at me with those dark eyes that caught the firelight and held it. "Why 6 months ago?" she asked. I considered the question with the honesty it deserved. "Because 6 months ago I began to suspect that the line I had been maintaining had not been maintained," I said. "That what I told myself was service had been, in several important instances, complicity." I touched the ring. "That difference matters to me more than I had acknowledged." She looked at the ring. "You took it off in the study," she said. "The night we talked. Yes. What does it mean? That you take it off? I looked at it. It was taken from a man who had convinced himself that the information he sold was harmless, that the people who died as a result of it were abstractions, that his cleverness absolved him of consequence. I turned it slowly. I wear it to remember that the thing a man tells himself about why he does what he does is not the same as the thing he is actually doing. The justification and the act are separate things. She was very still. And taking it off, she said, means I am done justifying, I said. She reached across the space between us and took my right hand, the one with the ring. She turned it in her fingers very gently, and then she looked up at me. The man you took it from, she said. Did he understand what he had done before the end? I don't know, I said. I hope so. I think it matters. Whether a person understands the weight of their choices before they run out of time to do anything about them. I paused. I think it is the only distinction that has any real value in the end. She set my hand down, but did not remove hers from it. We sat like that while the fire settled, and the wind came across the moor, and the lodge was very small and very warm in the middle of all that cold dark. In the morning, Terence returned from York with a letter from Colonel Richard Ashby. I read it standing in the doorway of the lodge, with the winter light coming, grey and flat, across the heather. Ashby had received the book. He had looked at 3 pages and immediately understood what he was looking at. He had taken it directly to the Secretary at War. A warrant had been issued for the examination of the Duke of Blackmere's correspondence, and accounts on grounds of suspected treason under the Statute of 1797. The Duke did not yet know. He would know, Ashby wrote, within 48 hours. Because these things leaked always, and when he knew, his first action would be to eliminate the source. At the bottom of the letter, Ashby had written, "The fabricated desertion charge against Private James Parish, 4th Regiment, has been reviewed and dismissed. The man is free." I went inside and gave the letter to Dot first. She read it. She set it down. She picked it back up and read it again. Then she set it down and stared at the table for a moment in a way that was not composed at all. I looked away. Some things require privacy even in a single-room lodge. Isolde read the letter after. She read it completely and put it in her cuff and looked at me. 48 hours, she said. Yes, I said. Then we need to be there, she said. When he moves, we need to be in front of it, not behind it. Blackmere House in the East Riding, I said. That is where he will go. He has a house there. The grounds are managed, private, and it is 40 miles from the nearest magistrate, who is not on his payroll. Then that is where we go, she said. Dot had recovered herself entirely by the time we were preparing to leave. She was folding linens with the brisk economy of someone whose coping mechanism was competence. And she said, without looking up, "I'm going to tell you both something." We both looked at her. "I have been sending the Duke's weekly reports since November," she said. "They have been entirely accurate in their description of activities, which have been entirely benign, because I was careful about what I allowed him to observe." She refolded a pillowcase with precision. "I want to be clear that I have not, in any report, mentioned the sketchbook, the private cipher sessions, the letter to Terence's contact, or anything that occurred in this lodge." She looked up. "In the event that is ever relevant." "It is relevant now," Isolde said. "Thank you, Dot." Dot made the particular gesture of someone acknowledging gratitude in a way that required no further discussion, and went to pack. I looked at Isolde across the lodge, across the extinguished fire, across the 10 days of proximity that had changed the architecture of everything. "You should know," I said, "that I intend to send my own letter to Colonel Ashby today, a letter of resignation from the Duke's service, and a personal account of 6 years of operations, with every detail I can document. She looked at me steadily. "It will not be comfortable for me," I said. "Some of what I have done will require examination. I will not exempt myself from that." "I know," she said. "I am telling you because you should understand fully what you have beside you, before we walk into whatever comes next." She was quiet for a moment. Then she crossed the room and took my face in her hands, the left one, trembling slightly, steadily, as it always did under pressure, and she looked at me with the full, clear, undisguised expression that she almost never showed. "I have understood fully since the library," she said. "I have simply been waiting for you to understand yourself." She kissed me. And then we packed, and we went to face the Duke. Chapter 11. Isolde Blackmere House sat at the end of a mile-long approach road between bare November elms, and it was every inch a seat of power. Symmetrical, white stone, enormous windows, the kind of house built by men who wanted the world to look at their domestic arrangements and understand that there was nowhere higher to go. We arrived in Cael's carriage at 2 in the afternoon, on a Thursday in the last week of December, in thin winter sunlight that made everything look cleaner than it was. We were not expected. That was deliberate. The Duke's intelligence, good as it was, had been working off Dot's reports, which meant he knew we were at a moorland lodge on the moors north of Ashley Court. He did not know Terence had carried the sketchbook to York. He did not know Colonel Ashby had read it. He did not know the warrant existed. He was about to know all 3 things in rapid succession, and I intended to be standing in front of him when he did. The butler, a tall, expressionless man of the type that large establishments produce, told us his grace was not receiving. Cael looked at him with the particular quality of attention that made tall, expressionless men reassess their positions. "Tell him," Cael said, "that Miss Ashworth and Mr. Mercer have arrived and wish to speak with him before the warrant officers." The butler went. We were received. The Duke of Blackmere was in his library, a room twice the size of Mercer Hall's, every surface carefully arranged as a theatre of cultured authority. And he was standing when we entered, which told me he had had just enough time to compose himself from something that had disturbed his composure. His face was as pleasantly arranged as always, but his left hand at his side was slightly rigid. "Mercer," he said. "Miss Ashworth, what an unexpected pleasure." He looked between us. "You appear to have survived the moors." "Admirably," I said. He gestured to the chairs. We did not sit. "I believe," the Duke said, his tone shifting slightly to something more precise, "that there has been some misunderstanding about the arrangements I communicated through Dot Parish." "No misunderstanding," I said. "The arrangements were clear. They simply did not achieve what you intended." He looked at me with the particular assessment of a man who has underestimated something and is recalibrating. "And what did I intend, Miss Ashworth?" "To remove me before Colonel Ashby had the opportunity to read my sketchbook," I said. "Specifically, before the architectural drawings in chapters 4 through 9 could be decoded and understood as a complete record of your network's communications with French intelligence." I paused. Beginning in 1810, the silence in the room was the specific kind that follows a very accurate shot. The Duke looked at me. He looked at Cael. He looked at the space between us, which was not the space it had been in his library. On the evening he had made me demonstrate my skills over the pheasant, and something moved in his face. Not fear, exactly, but the first genuine crack in the performance. "You have submitted documentation to the Horse Guards," he said. "I have," I said. "In the sketchbook, which Colonel Ashby confirmed receiving 3 days ago." I reached into my cuff I also have in my possession a copy of the cipher notation that links your correspondence to the code designation Larkspur, the same notation that appears in 7 separate intercepts of French intelligence communications over 4 years. I set the copy on his library desk. You are Larkspur, Your Grace. You have been selling Crown intelligence to French interests since 1810. You sold it through a postal channel in Bristol. You received payment through a Dutch banking house in 3 currencies. The documentation covers all of it. He was very still. His face had settled into something that was no longer pleasant and no longer performing. You are a viscount's daughter who has been in the country for 8 weeks, he said. Whatever you believe you have documented is corroborated by testimony from the Marquis de Villiers, I said, who has agreed, in exchange for continued quiet residence in England, to provide a full written account to the Secretary at War. De Villiers has been cooperative. He is, it turns out, rather tired. I looked at the Duke steadily. You are welcome to contest it. The warrant will provide you with ample opportunity. He turned to Cael. There was a quality in the look, the particular quality of a man who has reached for his most reliable weapon and found it has been taken. Mercer, he said, you understand what this means? I do, Cael said. His voice was very quiet. It means I am no longer in your employ, Your Grace. The Duke looked at him for a long moment. You have nothing, he said. Without my patronage, you are a coal miner's son with blood on his hands and a modest estate. You will be ruined. Possibly, Cael said, though I find I am willing to manage it. The Duke turned back to me. He was composing himself with visible effort, reassembling the charming mask over the cold thing underneath. Miss Ashworth, he said, I admire you, genuinely. I always knew you were something extraordinary. What I fail to understand is why you would choose. He looked at Cael, the slight inflection on the word, choose doing a great deal of work. This. Because it is mine to choose, I said. Which is the thing you never understood about me, Your Grace. The Viscount sold you my skills and my situation. He could not sell you my judgment. Outside the windows, I heard the sound of carriages on the approach road. The Duke heard it too. Warrant officers, I said, from York. Colonel Ashby's arrangement. I believe they are accompanied by 2 solicitors and a representative of the Secretary at War's office. I picked up my gloves from the chair where I had set them. I would suggest, Your Grace, that you receive them with the graciousness your breeding requires. I walked to the door. Cael fell into step beside me. At the threshold, I turned. One more thing, I said. Private James Parrish of the 4th Regiment. The fabricated desertion charge has been dismissed. Parrish remains under no obligation to you or to anyone you might subsequently direct. I paused. I thought you should know that leverage is only leverage when the person you are holding it over has no other recourse. I walked out of the Duke of Blackmere's library and into the entrance hall where, through the open front door, I could see 2 carriages coming up the approach road and a uniformed officer already dismounting. Cael was beside me. His hand found mine in the entrance hall. Briefly, a contact of several seconds, and I felt the steadiness of it all the way to the tremor in my left hand. Well, he said. Yes, I said. We are going to require legal assistance, he said. I have Ashby, I said. He is thorough. I know a solicitor in Harrogate who is not on any Duke's payroll, he said. Useful, I said. We stood in the entrance hall of the Duke of Blackmere's house and watched the warrant officers come up the steps, and I thought about my father's empty chair in the solicitor's office, and the rain and the word asset in a different hand on a document already signed, and how entirely, completely, irreversibly things could change in 8 weeks. My hand was trembling. I let it. Chapter 12. Cael was shot coming out of the Duke's morning room. She had been in there, we learned afterward, not because she had been sent there, but because she had followed one of the Duke's men into the room, when she overheard him say something about a Master Dowd document he intended to burn before the warrant officers reached it. She had taken the document. She had walked out of the room with it folded under her arm. The man had shot her in the left shoulder. She was conscious when I reached her. She had fallen against the wall in the corridor, one hand pressed to the wound, the document still under her other arm, her face the color of old plaster, and her expression one of profound personal affront. "I have it," she said, when I knelt beside her. "Don't let the floor bleed on it, the document." "Dot," I said. "I'm quite all right," she said, which was objectively incorrect. "It was a small caliber ball, and I have experienced worse inconveniences." She held out the document. "Take it. That is a payment ledger in the Duke's handwriting. I believe it is what Miss Ashworth will want." I took the document. I pressed my coat against her shoulder. Terence appeared from the end of the corridor. He had heard the shot and come at a run. And I said, "The carriage." Now, and Terence had her up, and moving both the Duke's men could regroup. The warrant officers secured the Duke in his library. He did not attempt to flee. That was the measure of the man. Even in extremity, he understood that a Duke attempting to flee through his own grounds would be worse, socially, than standing his ground with dignity. He was, to the last, more concerned with the performance of aristocratic composure than with any genuine reckoning. I found that more contemptible than anything else about him. Isolde was with Dot in the carriage when I reached it. She had torn a strip from her own petticoat. The second time in this business that a petticoat had served a military purpose, and was pressing it efficiently against the wound, while Dot said things about the Duke's antecedents that were specific, vivid, and probably accurate. "She needs a surgeon," I said. "There is one in Market Weighton," Terence said, 8 miles. "I know the house. Go," I said. We rode to Market Weighton, with the winter light failing around us. Dot was conscious the whole way, which was either reassuring or a testament to the force of her personality. She spent most of the journey describing in considerable detail what she intended to say to the Duke's man. When she had recovered sufficiently to say, Isolde held her hand and made no attempt to moderate the description. The surgeon in Market Weighton was a retired naval man named Dr. Geoffrey Holt, who looked at the wound with the brisk competence of someone who had seen worse before breakfast in his previous career, extracted the ball with a precision that made Dot produce a single sharp sound, and then go entirely silent with determination, and pronounce the shoulder a minor incident that would cause no lasting difficulty provided she rested it for a fortnight. A fortnight, Dot repeated with the tone of someone who had been told they were to be transported. 2 weeks, the surgeon said without sympathy, or you will undo my work and I will charge you again. We stayed the night in Market Weighton. Dot was installed in the surgeon's upper room with Terence at the door. Isolde and I sat downstairs with the surgeon's fire and his good Yorkshire ale, and I unfolded the document Dot had carried out of the Duke's morning room under a lead ball. It was a ledger, 8 pages. The Duke's handwriting, I knew it well, had spent 6 years reading instructions in it, and dates from 1810 through to that autumn, amounts in pounds and francs and guilders, initials beside each entry, on the final page, in a column headed with the code BC, Blackmere's personal cipher for accounts he did not want his solicitor to see. 4 entries, each with an amount and a description. The descriptions were not payments, they were outcomes, 4 names, 4 dates, 4 words. The word was resolved. I had known, in the abstract, what the Duke did with the intelligence he sold, that it had costs, that men and women on the Crown's side had suffered and died for information that had passed through his hands. I had known this the way you know that a fire is dangerous, not from having touched it, but from understanding its nature. The ledger made it concrete. I set it on the table and looked at the fire. Isolde was reading it. She read it completely, and then she set it beside mine and folded her hands on the table. Her left hand was trembling. She did not press it flat. "4," she said. "Yes," I said. "He treated it as a domestic account," she said. Her voice was very even. "The same hand he used to note the wine expenditure." Yes, she was quiet for a long time. Outside, the market town was quiet under a winter sky. A dog barked twice and stopped. "This goes to Ashby," she said, "with the sketchbook, with de Villiers' testimony, with my encoded intercepts." She looked at me. "It will be enough." "It is more than enough," I said. She picked up her ale and looked at it, and then she set it down again without drinking. "One of those names," she said. "The second one, I know who that was." I looked at the entry, the date, 1812. "He was a Crown courier," she said, "the Fontainebleau courier. I decoded a dispatch about his death in my second month of work. His name was Thomas Mead. He had a daughter in Canterbury who was 7 years old." She paused. "I remember reading his name in a dispatch and thinking, someone will tell her. Someone will tell that 7-year-old child in Canterbury that her father served England and was honored for it." She looked at me. I do not know if anyone ever told her. There was nothing useful I could say. I did not try to say anything useful. She picked up the ledger and placed it in her satchel. She closed the clasp. She looked at me. "I want this done," she said. "Completely done. I want the full record in the right hands and the right people in possession of it, and then I want—" She paused. "I want a room with north-facing windows and enough silence to work in." She looked at her left hand. "And I want to stop pretending the tremor is something to be hidden." "It was never something to be hidden," I said. "I know that now," she said. "I am simply noting the intention." I reached across the table and placed the ring, the French spy's ring, the 6-year reminder, on the table between us. "I am done with the justification," I said. "Whatever comes out of the examination of my service, and some of it will be uncomfortable, I will face it without the justification." She looked at the ring on the table. Then she looked at me. "We will face it," she said, and that was the word that mattered. "We," spoken without performance, without decoration, with the simple and absolute certainty of someone who had made a decision and did not see any reason to be dramatic about it. I picked up the ring and put it in my pocket, not to wear, to carry differently. In the morning, Dot announced from the upper room that she was entirely recovered and wished to return to Mercer Hall, where she had several outstanding tasks she had not completed. And did anyone think she was going to spend a fortnight in a surgeon's house in Market, waiting while everyone else did the interesting work? We were on the road by 8. Chapter 13, Isolde. The Duke of Blackmere was charged formally in the second week of January 1815. The charges were read in the presence of the Secretary at War, 2 members of the Privy Council, and a representative of the Crown's Intelligence Office, who had, it emerged, been waiting for exactly this kind of documentation for considerably longer than I had been gathering it. The warrant had been expanded based on the ledger Dot had retrieved. The examination of the Duke's papers at Blackmere House produced further evidence, including correspondence with 3 French military officials that had never been seen by any British intelligence officer. The Duke appeared, throughout all of it, impeccably composed. He did not raise his voice. He did not attempt to deny the material facts. He engaged his legal counsel, a formidable man from Gray's Inn, and deployed every procedural defense available. It did not ultimately help him. He was stripped of the office of Crown Commissioner, a role he had held for a decade and used as the engine of his access to military intelligence. His estates were placed under examination. He was removed from the peerage roll, pending the conclusion of the criminal proceedings, which, given the weight of the documented evidence, were expected to conclude in his formal conviction within the year. The social destruction was immediate and total. The peerage did not forgive treason. It forgave vice, extravagance, cruelty, and almost every category of personal failure. It did not forgive selling crown secrets to France while British soldiers died in the peninsula. The Duke was quietly erased from every invitation list, every club, every social arrangement in England before the January snow had fully settled. He became, with remarkable speed, a name spoken in past tense. My father called at Mercer Hall in the last week of January. He arrived unannounced, which was presumably an attempt at maintaining some authority over proceedings. Mrs. Blythe, with the serene inflexibility of a woman who had managed 3 difficult households, told him Mr. Mercer was not at home and Miss Ashworth was not receiving. I watched from the library window as the Viscount's carriage sat in the drive for a quarter of an hour, and then turned around and went back down the road. I had nothing to say to him that would have served either of us. The debt had been cleared. The transaction had been made. I was no longer subject to his management, and I found that the emotion I felt watching his carriage leave was not the grief I might have expected, but something much quieter and considerably less painful. I was free of it, that was all. I went back to my work. I was still working for the Crown. The connection had been re-established, through Ashby's office, cleanly, with a new contact who had been vetted with thoroughness, and a professional directness that was a considerable improvement on the previous arrangement. The work was essentially the same. Intercepted correspondence, encoded communications, the slow, patient labor of decoding what various governments were saying to each other, when they believed no one was listening. The difference was that I now did it openly, at a desk in the East Wing Library of Mercer Hall, with the sketchbooks on the shelf behind me, in their proper order, the record of everything visible and real. Cael's examination by the Crown's Intelligence Office took 3 weeks in February. He went to London for it, to the Horse Guards, and submitted 6 years of operational records, with the systematic completeness of someone who had been preparing for exactly this for some time. Colonel Ashby chaired the examination. 2 operations were flagged for deeper review. One of them was resolved in Cael's favor within the week. The evidence showed clearly that his instructions had come directly from the Duke, with no Crown authorization. The second took longer. He wrote to me from London every 3 days. The letters were brief and entirely characteristic, precise, spare, with the occasional understated observation that was doing considerable emotional work in very few words. One letter said, "The examination is thorough, Ashby is fair. I find I do not mind the accounting, which surprises me." Another said, "The room here is small and faces south. I find I have developed a strong preference for north-facing rooms." The third said only, "I will be home Thursday. Do not let Mrs. Blythe reorganize the study." He was home Thursday. The examination concluded in the first week of March with a formal assessment that Cael's service, while conducted under the direction of a man subsequently convicted of treason, had not involved the direct compromising of Crown intelligence, and that his personal conduct had been consistent with the obligation he had operated under, rather than with any independent disloyalty. he was issued a letter to that effect, signed by 3 senior officers. He brought the letter home and set it on the study desk without ceremony. Dot read it over his shoulder and said, "Took them long enough," and went to organize dinner. I was in the library when he came to find me. He stood in the doorway and looked at me at the reading table with my work spread around me, and the sketchbooks on the shelf, and the north-facing windows letting in the pale March light. I looked at him, he looked at me. The accounting was done, the record was clear, the very long, very expensive, very specific machinery of consequences had moved and was moving and would keep moving toward its conclusions without us having to drive it any further. "Well," I said. "Yes," he said. He came into the library and sat in the chair across the table from me, and we looked at each other across the morning light with the particular shared exhaustion and extraordinary lightness of 2 people who have been in a fight for a very long time and have just definitively won it. "I should like," I said. "To stay at Mercer," he said. "I should like," I said, "to continue my work here." "Yes," he said, "and I should like," I said, "to know what your intentions are, Mr. Mercer, with regard to the several hundred things that have accumulated between us since November." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he reached into his coat pocket and placed the ring on the table between us. The French spy's ring, the old reminder. "My intention," he said, "is to replace that with something that means something different." I looked at the ring on the table. I looked at him. "That will require a jeweler," I said. "I know a man in Harrogate," he said. I picked up the ring. I held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it, the 6 years of warning it represented. Then I set it down at the edge of the table, apart from us at a distance. "All right," I said. "Harrogate, then." Chapter 14, Cael. We were married in April in the village church 3 miles east of Mercer Hall in a ceremony that was attended by Mrs. Blythe, Terence, Dot, Colonel Richard Ashby, who came from London for the occasion, and brought excellent brandy, the village rector, who conducted proceedings with brisk good humour, and a single letter from the Viscount Ashworth, which arrived that morning and which Isolde read, standing by the library window, then folded carefully, and placed in the top drawer of her desk without comment. I did not ask what it said. She did not tell me. Some things do not require excavation. She wore grey, the same thoughtful, practical elegance she brought to everything, and she carried a small posy of early springing flowers that Dot had produced from the walled garden, with the satisfied air of someone whose horticultural efforts had just achieved their finest deployment. She walked to the church on her own feet and stood beside me, with her hands folded in front of her, the left one trembling faintly, steadily, the way it always did. And she looked at me when the rector asked the relevant question, with an expression that was completely unguarded and entirely clear. Ashby, who was standing behind us, said afterward at the small dinner Mrs. Blythe had arranged that he had attended 40 years of military campaigns and never been as genuinely moved as he was in that church, which Dot said was either a commentary on the military or a compliment of the highest order, and possibly both. Cael Mercer of Whitmore, South Yorkshire, formerly of His Majesty's Army, currently in the service of no one except himself and the Crown's Intelligence Office, by independent, contracted arrangement, which had been Ashby's suggestion and a reasonable one, was a married man, with a north-facing library, with a woman who decoded French correspondence at midnight and drew building measurements in the margins of her sketchbooks, and pressed her left hand flat on surfaces when she was furious, and once in a hunting lodge on the moors had told me I was the first person to fully see her, the thing that had been changing since that first night in the solicitor's office, since the carriage and the 6-week siege of shared proximity and the fire in the lodge, had settled into something that was, now, simply the shape of my life. That it had been hard to get to was not its most important quality. That I would do it again from any starting point was. In the summer, Dot's brother James came to stay at Mercer Hall for a week on his way to a new posting. He was a cheerful, uncomplicated young man with Dot's dark eyes and a blunt good nature that expressed itself in the eating of everything Mrs. Blythe put in front of him with whole-hearted appreciation. Dot showed him the grounds with the proprietary authority of someone whose home this was, which made Mrs. Blythe look quietly pleased, and made me understand something about what the house had been to Dot over the past year. I stood on the steps watching them walk across the walled garden and thought about the shape of things. About the way a house becomes a place where people have been through difficulty together and come out the other side. About the way loyalty, tested and broken and rebuilt, is a different and more enduring thing than loyalty never tested. About the fact that the man who had drunk my port and smiled pleasantly in my house while conducting the systematic dismantling of my integrity was now standing before a criminal court, and that the woman who had been placed in my keeping as a transaction was now standing in the East Wing library, with the door open and the windows catching the late summer light, and a quill moving across a page, and a pot of tea on the edge of the desk getting cold because she had forgotten it in the absorbing business of decoding something very clever that someone had believed was unbreakable. In the autumn I went to Harrogate. I returned with a ring, plain gold, a simple band, made by a goldsmith who understood that the woman wearing it worked with her hands and needed nothing that would interfere with a quill's passage across hot press paper. I gave it to her in the library because that seemed exactly right, and she held her left hand out. And I placed it on her finger, and it settled there as though it had been designed for precisely that purpose and no other. The French spy's ring I put in a box at the back of the study cabinet, not destroyed. Kept, because forgetting the weight of things was more dangerous than carrying it. The autumn turned toward winter. We were well. Chapter 15, Isolde. The room we chose for the study had north-facing windows. It was on the first floor of the East Wing, adjacent to the library, with a view across the walled garden to the moor beyond. In the mornings, the light came in clean and grey and steady, without the directional drama of sun, the light that painters use because it does not flatter or deceive, the kind of light that shows things as they are. I had a writing desk, a reading chair, a set of shelves. On the shelves were the sketchbooks, all of them, from the first one I had arrived with, worn at the corners, to the current one, which was the 6th in the series Cael had provided. Each one represented a phase of the work. Each one was, on its surface, a record of architectural observations. Each one contained, in the architectural notations, the encoded record of 2 years of intelligence work. They were not encoded anymore. I had written, in the front of each book, in plain English, what the notes in the margins meant and how to read them for the record. Because one of the things I had learned in 2 years of working with informations that could not speak for itself was that clarity had its own kind of courage. The keeping of secrets was sometimes necessary and sometimes just a habit of self-protection that outlasted the danger requiring it. Dot sat across from me in the reading chair on an October afternoon, darning something with the absent precision of a woman whose hands knew their work too well to need her attention, and looked at the room with the critical eye of someone assessing an arrangement's quality. "You need curtains," she said. "I like the light," I said. "The light is very good," she agreed. "I meant for the winter. It will be cold with bare glass." "Wool curtains," I said. "Dark green." She nodded. "I'll see to it." This was Dot, the woman who had been placed in my household by a duke who intended to use her as a surveillance instrument, and who had become, through a sequence of choices that I understood were neither simple nor without cost, the person in this house who knew me most completely, and who managed the domestic arrangements of Mercer Hall with the authority of someone who had decided, without announcement, that this was her place. She had received a formal letter from the Crown's Intelligence Office in September, acknowledging her service in the Blackmere investigation and confirming that no charges arising from her earlier association with the Duke's surveillance network would be pursued. The letter also included, somewhat to everyone's surprise, a recommendation for remuneration at a classified rate for services rendered. She had read the letter, said about time, and filed it in the household accounts. James wrote monthly from his posting. The letters were cheerful and somewhat illegible, and contained many descriptions of food. Dot read them at the kitchen table, and wrote back with the news from Mercer Hall, which she managed to make considerably more interesting than it perhaps was, and which I suspected James enjoyed enormously. "Dot," I said, on that October afternoon, setting down my quill. She looked up from the darning. "I should like to tell you something," I said. She waited, with the patience that was one of her most fundamental qualities. "I am with child," I said. She was still for a moment. The darning did not move. Then she set it down on the chair arm and looked at me with an expression that was entirely unguarded and rather beautiful. "Isolde," she said. "Yes," I said. "Does Mr. Mercer know?" "Not yet," I said. "I am telling you first, because you will know before I can manage the conversation with him. You always do, and I would prefer to tell you directly rather than have you deduce it from the biscuit consumption." She laughed. A real one, sudden and bright. "How long?" she asked. 12 weeks, I believe." She stood up. She crossed the room and sat on the edge of the desk, which was not a thing she would normally do, but which she did now without apparent awareness, and she looked at me with an expression that contained several layers of feeling operating simultaneously. "You are not afraid?" she asked. I thought about this honestly. "I am afraid of specific things," I said. "I am afraid of all the things that can go wrong, because I have read enough to know the catalogue. I am not afraid of the thing itself." I paused. "I am." I looked at my left hand, the ring, the tremor, faint and steady. "I am very glad," I said, which was the simplest and most accurate version of it. Dot put her hand over mine, both hands, steady and warm. "He will be extraordinary about it," she said, in his very particular way. "Yes," I said, "I know." He was in the south pasture when I went to find him, checking the fence line with Terence in the late afternoon light. Yorkshire autumn, pale gold on the heather, the smell of cold coming. He saw me crossing the field and said something to Terence, who took himself to the far end of the fence with the discretion of a man who has learned that some conversations require a perimeter. Cael came toward me. He moved with the same ground-covering economy he always had. The walk of a man who had covered a great deal of difficult terrain and stopped noticing that he was doing it quickly. He reached me and stopped. He looked at my face. He was very perceptive. He had always been very perceptive, and 6 months of marriage had made me considerably more legible to him than most people ever became to anyone. "Tell me," he said. 12 weeks, I said. He was still. The autumn light was on him, on the angles of his face, on the ink visible at his collar, where the tattoos began. The maps of campaigns, the record of where he had been before here. He was looking at me with an expression that I had never seen on him before, even in the worst of last winter, even in the best of the spring. It was the expression of a man discovering that the thing he had not known he wanted was already present, and had been growing quietly for 12 weeks. 12 weeks, he repeated. Approximately, I said. Dr. Holt will confirm. He reached out and took my left hand, the one with the ring, the one with the tremor. He held it between both of his, steady, the way he had held it on the table in the hunting lodge. "A child," he said. "Yes," I said. He looked at my hand for a long moment. Then he looked up at me. "Are you?" "I am very well," I said. "I am also rather cold. The field is not the ideal venue." He pulled me into him, not the urgent, desperate contact of last winter. This was different, slower, the embrace of a man who is not trying to hold something in place, but simply holding. I rested against his chest and listened to his heart and felt the Yorkshire wind come across the moor with its habitual indifference to human affairs, and thought about all the rooms I had drawn, all the walls I had measured, all the exits I had mapped. I had been mapping exits for 17 years, since the Somerset fire. Since the night I understood that knowing the way out was the only guarantee that there was always a way in again. I was not mapping exits anymore. I was, for the first time in my adult life, mapping something else. The dimensions of this. The precise, irreplaceable weight of being exactly where I chose to be. "We should tell Mrs. Blythe," I said. "She will want to reorganize the East Wing rooms." She has been waiting for an excuse to reorganize the East Wing rooms since 1812, Cael said, against my hair. "The study stays as it is," I said. "Naturally," he said. We walked back to the house together across the field, and the light fell across the moors in long gold lines, and the house was ahead of us, with its smoke rising and its windows lit, and it looked like what it was. A place where people had been through considerable difficulty, and come out the other side into something that was, now simply good. Chapter 16. Cael. In the study with the north-facing windows, on a February evening in 1815, I sat and watched my wife work. The candlelight was good. She had a position she settled into at this desk, slightly forward, left hand flat on the table, holding the paper down, right hand moving with the precise, unhurried movements of someone who has been doing this work long enough that the mechanics of it are entirely below thought. The sketchbooks were on the shelves. The curtains Dot had provided, dark green wool, very good, were drawn against the cold outside. She was 6 months along. She was working on a set of intercepts that had arrived through Ashby's office the previous week. French diplomatic correspondence from the renewed negotiations written in a new cipher variation that someone in Paris had believed was original, and which Isolde had identified as a modification of a 1809 system within 40 minutes of first seeing it. She had, with typical economy, sent a letter to Ashby simply noting the identification and providing the decryption key. She had not sent the decoded correspondence itself. She had not yet worked through it fully. She was working through it now. I was reading, or attempting to. I had a copy of Gibbon's Decline and Fall that I had been working through for the past year and a half, which was the natural pace of a man who read at odd hours and kept being interrupted by events. I was on the 3rd volume. It was very good. I was not reading it at this precise moment. I was watching her. This had become a habit, not in the way of surveillance. I had spent too long doing surveillance to confuse it with what this was. This was simply the particular pleasure of watching someone operate in the full current of their own capability, in a place they had made their own, without anyone requiring them to be different or smaller or more manageable. She set down the quill. She looked at what she had written. Then she looked up and saw me watching her, and the corner of her mouth moved in the way it did when she was choosing not to say, "I know you have not turned that page in 20 minutes. "It is very good," she said. "What is?" "Gibbon," she said. "The third volume particularly." I turned the page. She laughed. It was a real one, the kind she produced without editing, the kind I had come to regard as one of the more extraordinary things in my daily life. The baby moved. I saw it in the slight shift of her expression, not discomfort, more like acknowledgement. She looked down at her left hand on the table. "He is agreeing with Gibbon," she said. "Or disagreeing," I said. "He may have strong views." "She," Isolde said. "We will see," I said. She picked up her quill and went back to work. I went back to Gibbon, and the fire settled, and the candles burned, and the Yorkshire winter did what it always did outside the dark green curtains. The Duke of Blackmere's trial concluded in March of 1815. He was convicted on 12 counts under the treason statute. The sentence was transportation, life, which was both the legal consequence and the social destruction that Isolde had argued from the beginning was the only proportionate response. He was not hanged. That was a question of status and politics that was above both of us, and we made our peace with it on the grounds that what we had achieved was sufficient. The name Blackmere was struck from the active peerage rolls. The title would not pass. The estate was forfeit. The extensive intelligence network he had built was dismantled methodically by people who were better equipped to do it than I had been. His last public appearance, before the transportation, was described to me by Ashby in a letter with economy of a man who knew what the information would mean. He asked after you both. I did not tell him. Good. On a Thursday in April, in the very early morning, Isolde's work was interrupted by the arrival of a more pressing priority. Dr. Holt came from Market Weighton. Dot was remarkable. Terence, stationed outside the door by his own decision, did not move from the corridor for 6 hours. I sat in the north-facing study and turned my ring. The old habit, the old reflex, except that the ring was no longer the French spy's ring, which was in the cabinet. The ring I turned now was the plain gold band from the goldsmith in Harrogate, and what I was calculating was nothing that had a cost. At 7 in the morning, Dot opened the study door. "Come in," she said. "Both of you need to meet each other." The child was small. Of course she was small. She was new to the enterprise. She had dark hair, and an expression of profound assessment that she had, apparently, arrived with, as though she had decided to take the measure of the place before committing to an opinion of it. Isolde was pale and tired and entirely herself. She looked at the child with the same quality of attention she brought to everything. The full, present, measuring regard that was not distance but precision. Taking the weight of it, "Mia," she said. It was a name we had agreed on in November, in the north-facing study, without great ceremony. A name for someone we had not forgotten and did not intend to. "Mia," I agreed. I held my daughter. She was warm and real, and the most specific thing that had ever existed. Dot was watching from the doorway, with an expression she was managing with less than her usual success. She said, "She has your eyes, Isolde," and her voice had something in it that required a moment before she could continue. "And his eyebrows, which is a lot for such a small person." She came in and set a cup of tea on the nightstand for Isolde, and then she went out and closed the door quietly behind her. I sat on the edge of the bed with Mia and looked at Isolde. She was looking at the window, the north-facing light coming in grey and steady, the kind that does not flatter or deceive, the kind that shows things as they are. "We are free," she said. quietly, not triumphantly. It was not a proclamation, it was an observation. "Yes," I said. She reached over and rested her right hand on my arm. My left hand, holding the child, was still. No ring on it, the plain gold band was on the right. The French spy's ring was in the cabinet downstairs. We sat, in the morning light, in the room with the north-facing windows, in the house that had been a fortress, and was now a home, with everything that had been gained, and everything that had been lost exactly where it belonged. Not behind us, not buried, but present and accounted for, carried as a weight that had become part of the structure. Outside, across the moors, the April morning was doing what Yorkshire mornings did. Arriving without ceremony, grey and clear, and entirely indifferent to human arrangements, which was, in its way, comforting. The world continued. The work continued. The letters would come from Ashby's office next week, and there would be new intercepts to decode. And the sketchbooks would fill up, and the shelves would require more room, and Dot would find a solution to the shelving problem that involved reorganizing 2 adjacent rooms. And Mrs. Blythe would have opinions, and Terence would carry things without comment. And Mia Mercer would grow up in a house with north-facing windows, and a library, and a mother who had been the most dangerous person in every room she entered, and a father who had learned, too late and just in time, what it meant to put down the thing you had been carrying in place of something worth carrying. She would know, when she was old enough, the full weight of it. The viscount's empty chair, the rain-soaked solicitor's office, the word asset in a different hand, the lodge on the moors, the sketchbooks, the tremor that was never fear. She would know because her mother would tell her, clearly, without decoration, because clarity had its own kind of courage. And we were, at last, free to use it. Chapter 17, Isolde. 3 years after the rain-soaked night in a Holborn solicitor's office, I stood in the study with the north-facing windows, and understood that I had stopped mapping exits. It arrived not as a dramatic realization, but as a simple noticing. The sketchbook in my hand was open to a page I had been working on that morning, not a building plan, not a measured distance to a gate, not the careful notations of a woman preparing for the worst. I had been drawing the walled garden, just the walled garden as it looked in the 2nd week of April, with the first green things coming through the beds and the stone walls, holding the warmth in. I had drawn it because I wanted to, because it was beautiful, because after 3 years of living with it, I had not grown accustomed to it. I had drawn it without measuring anything. Mia was on the rug, with the wooden animals Terence had carved over the winter. She was 1 year old, and in possession of strong opinions about the arrangement of wooden animals that she expressed through a combination of determined repositioning and occasional narration in a language that was not yet English, but was clearly specific in its meanings. Dot was in the chair by the fire, reading. She had, with the gradual authority of someone who had stopped pretending she was merely staff some time ago, claimed the reading chair in the north study as her natural position whenever Mia was present. This was less about the child, and more about the fact that the reading chair in the north study was the best reading chair in the house. And Dot knew. The letter from Ashby arrived, Dot said without looking up from her book. "I know," I said. "I read it this morning. He says the Marquis de Villiers has retired to Devonshire." Dot said. "I know," I said. "I am glad for him. He was tired of it." "Aren't we all?" Dot said, with the tone of someone who was not, in fact, particularly tired of it, but considered it a point of professional dignity to suggest otherwise. The letter from Ashby had contained the usual summary of ongoing matters. There were always ongoing matters, The intelligence work was never conclusively finished. The world persisted in generating secrets that required decoding. And a personal note at the bottom that said, "The Secretary at War has asked me to communicate his formal thanks for your continued contribution." I suggested they might communicate this themselves. They said it was not the custom. I said perhaps it should be. We did not reach agreement on this point, but I hold out hope. I was not particularly concerned about the Secretary at War's gratitude. What I was concerned with was the set of intercepts on my desk from the week prior, a new variation of a system I had been watching develop for the past 6 months, and whether the underlying key text had changed or whether the apparent variation was a deliberate misdirection. It was, I had concluded this morning, a misdirection. The key text was unchanged. The variation was a test, someone checking whether the system's security had been compromised, which meant it had not, which meant the intelligence from this source was still genuine. I wrote this conclusion in my working notes in plain English, with my reasoning, so that the analysis existed separately from the decoded text. This was a habit I had developed over 3 years of continued work. The parallel record, the reasoning visible alongside the conclusion. I had argued to Ashby that the decoded text was worth considerably less without the methodology that produced it, because methodology could be transferred and applied and improved upon, whereas decoded text simply described what had already been said. Ashby had agreed. He had also, with characteristic directness, suggested that I might consider writing the methodology down formally in a document that could be used for training purposes by others in the Crown's intelligence service. I was doing so. It was on the desk beside the intercepts, a long, careful document in plain English explaining, step by step, the methods I used for analysis, cipher breaking, and the identification of encoding patterns in foreign correspondence. It was, I understood, the first document of its kind produced by a woman for use in official intelligence training. I did not find this as remarkable as other people seemed to. I simply found it necessary. The work required it. The methods were good. They should be preserved. I was on the 14th page. Cael came to the door at midday. He was in from the estate work. There was a drainage matter on the north field that had been occupying him for a week, and he had the particular look of a man who has been in the cold all morning, and has reached a conclusion about the drainage that he is privately pleased with. He looked at me at the desk, at Dot in the chair, at Mia on the rug with her wooden animals. "The drainage is resolved," he said. "I know," Dot said. "You have the look." Mia said something decisive about the wooden horse. Cael crouched down beside her on the rug and looked at the arrangement of animals with the serious attention that always made her produce a very specific sound of approval. He moved a wooden cow. She considered this, then moved it back to its original position and looked at him with the expression that was unmistakably his, the flat, measuring, entirely unimpressed assessment. I set down my quill. "She has your eyes," I said, "and your manner with rearrangements you disagree with." He looked up at me. The morning light was full on him, the angles of his face, the ink at his collar, the slight weathering that 3 Yorkshire winters had added to the weathering that 9 years of military service had already done. The plain gold ring on his right hand. The absence of the French spy's ring, which remained in the cabinet where it belonged. Not forgotten, not displayed. "How is the document?" he asked. "Page 14, I said. "Good progress. I expect to finish it by summer," I said. "Ashby wants it by autumn." "Ashby wants everything immediately," he said. "It is one of his defining characteristics." "He says please," I said. "He says it with urgency," Cael said, "which modifies the grammar considerably." Dot snorted. I looked at my left hand on the desk. The ring, the tremor, faint and steady. Present, as it had always been, the Ashworth inheritance, the physical fact of extreme feeling contained. I did not press it flat anymore. I let it be what it was. The sketchbooks on the shelves, the dark green curtains, the child on the rug narrating the horse, the candle burning low and needed replacing, the intelligence work on the desk, the methodology document, the 14th page, all of it visible, all of it real. I thought about the woman who had stood in a Holborn doorway in the rain and known that the thing done to her was wrong, had been done without her, had been designed to render her useful without her being required to agree to it, who had arrived at a stranger's house with work already in progress and a weapon already built from everything she had been underestimated for. I thought about what she would have made of this, of the study, of the shelves, of the child and the man, and the plain gold ring and the methodology document on page 14. She would have found it extraordinary, not because it was improbable. It was not improbable. It was simply the outcome of very precise choices made under extremely difficult circumstances. She would have found it extraordinary because she had not allowed herself to imagine it, because imagining it required a degree of hope that felt dangerous when the alternative was so much larger. I had learned to allow the hope. That was the education. Not the cipher systems, not the intelligence methodology, not the operational practice. The thing I had learned, over 3 years of difficult circumstances and one very specific Yorkshire winter, was that hope was not reckless. Hope was not the abandonment of precision. Hope was, itself, a form of analysis, the willingness to look at what was actually present rather than only what the worst case might produce, and to act from that reality rather than from fear of it. This was what I put on page 14. Not in those terms. The document was a technical guide to intelligence methodology and did not require philosophical insertion. But it was there, underneath the technical language, informing every principle. I laid down about observation and inference, and the gap between what appeared to be true and what was actually true. The gap between what appeared to be true and what was actually true. That had been everything, in the end. The Duke had appeared to be operating in the Crown's interest. The viscount had appeared to be performing a father's duty. Dot had appeared to be a surveillance instrument. Cael had appeared to be an agent of the enemy. None of these appearances were the truth. The truth required looking longer, more carefully, without the bias of first impression. It required the willingness to revise a conclusion when the evidence demanded it. It required the acknowledgement that the picture one assembled from available information was always provisional, always subject to new data, never entirely closed. I had been practicing this form of attention since I was 12 years old, and a fire in Somerset had shown me that the world could be understood with precision, and that understanding it with precision was, in itself, a form of protection. I was still practicing it. I expected I would practice it for the rest of my life. This seemed to me exactly right. Cael came to stand behind me, reading what I had written over my shoulder in the way he did when he was interested. Without wanting to interrupt, his hand rested on the back of my chair, present without demand. "Page 14, he said. "I told you," I said. "It is very good," he said. "You have not read it," I said. "I have been reading it since page 1, he said. "You leave the drafts on the desk." "I know," I said. "I intend for you to read them." He was quiet for a moment. "The section on misdirection," he said. Page 9. "The argument that the most effective misdirection is always structurally true. Yes." "You are writing about the Duke," he said. "I am writing about a principle," I said. "He is an example of it." "You are making him useful," Cael said. After everything, I thought about that. The understanding that can be extracted from even a very bad example, Abasi said, is worth having, provided the example is not allowed to define the argument. He moved his hand from the chair back to my shoulder, a brief, warm pressure. No, he said, it is not allowed to define it. Mia, on the rug, arrived at a conclusion about the wooden animals and announced it to the room. Dot looked up from her books and said, "Quite right," with the gravity of someone who had followed the entire deliberation. The candle needed replacing. The fire needed a piece of wood. The document on my desk was on page 14 and needed to reach page 20 by the end of the week if I was to finish it by summer. The sketchbooks were on the shelves. The curtains were dark green wool. The ring was plain gold on my left hand. And here is what is true about hard things. They change you, and you have the choice of what they change you into. The machinery of power that had treated Isolde Ashworth as a transaction, a debt-clearing mechanism, an intelligence asset to be deployed and discarded, had done so because it could not imagine that she would look clearly at its workings and choose not to be consumed by them, that she would take the full weight of it and convert it with patience and precision, and the particular furious intelligence of a woman who had been underestimated all her life into something that would outlast it. This is the thing worth knowing, the thing worth carrying out of the story. Not that good intentions prevail automatically, not that love resolves what power has broken, but that the careful, persistent, evidence-based work of understanding what is actually true, rather than what fear suggests, or convention assumes, or power declares, is itself a form of freedom that cannot be entirely bartered away, regardless of the documents already signed. She was still here. The work was still here, the north-facing windows, the tremor in my left hand, faint and steady. 1, 2, 1, 2. Not fear, not ever fear. Something that had always been there, waiting to be called by its right name. Isolde Ashworth arrived in a Holborn solicitor's office as a transaction. She left as herself, entirely, irrevocably on her own terms. That is what this story was always about. If it moved you, if Isolde's precision resonated, if Cael's reckoning felt real, if Dot made you laugh when everything was terrible, then I need one thing from you right now. Subscribe, because this channel tells stories about women who were underestimated and proved it catastrophically wrong. And there are more of them coming, and you deserve to be here when they do. Smash the like. Let the algorithm know this standard is worth finding. And leave me a comment. Tell me which moment stayed with you. The Holborn office, the hunting lodge, the ring on the desk, the tremor she stopped hiding. I read every single comment. I will say hello to you personally. I want to know exactly how far Isolde's story has traveled tonight. The next story is coming. It will be worth the wait. I will see you in the next chapter. A note on the history. This story is fiction, but the world it inhabits is real. During the Napoleonic Wars, women were systematically employed as intelligence assets across Europe, as couriers, as social operatives, and as code breakers, in roles that were never officially acknowledged and rarely recorded. The black chambers of European postal services, including Britain's own secret postal intercept offices, relied on code breakers who were paid in anonymity. The skills that Isolde uses were real skills, used by real people whose names were never entered in dispatches. The power imbalances of the Regency period, the legal ownership of women's persons and earnings, the debt structures that made daughters into collateral, the social systems that made a viscount's daughter simultaneously more educated than most. Men, and less legally powerful than any of them, were not dramatic inventions. They were the ordinary architecture of the world. What was also real, and less often told, was the persistent, documented fact of women who found the cracks in that architecture and worked through them with precision. Isolde is for them.